It looks like standing room only. I think this is in the last 5 years, this is the largest attendance that we've ever had at a meeting in a program. Congratulations. I put my glasses on so I can read. Okay. My name is Daniel D'Arcy. I'm the president of the Historical Association of Woodbridge Township. We meet here at the Presbyterian Church the fourth Monday of every month. We have some exciting events coming up. We have located here at the front with Audrey. We'll be selling tickets for the spaghetti dinner that we'll be having Friday at the Elks Club from 5 o'clock to 7, and there's a tricky tray also. And we have spaghetti. We'll have spaghetti. We'll have ziti. We'll have salads. We'll have bread. We'll have gluten-free. Where are you, Kath? Gluten-free spaghetti. We'll have meatballs and sausage. And if I have enough time, I'm actually going to probably make a cold antipasta also.
How much are the tickets?
The tickets price $15, $10 for children from 6 to 10, and under 6 is free. 6 to 12? Okay. And we have lots of desserts. We have cakes, pretzels, and a variety of other. Where's Brenda? Where's Brenda? Brenda knows what we're having for desserts. I can't see her. Okay. We have a very exciting program tonight, and Don Peck will introduce that in a few minutes. A couple other things. Has anyone seen, we were in Myrtle Beach, my wife and I were in Myrtle Beach last week, and it was rainy one day, and we went to the movies. And if you're familiar with Thou Shalt Not Grow Old, has anyone seen that yet? That's something you want to see. What they did, they took the old, about 600 clips of World War I, and they digitalized them, they cleaned them up, and they colorized them. So when we walked into the theater, we didn't think there'd be very many people in the theater to see that movie, and we walked in, we said, half full. Approximately the same age group here in this room, as you can imagine, but what a movie. Actually, it's a documentary, and when they build up to it in the very first scene where they slow everything down, they clean it up so it's like it's not World War I, it's being filmed yesterday. And when they take that first clip where they have the right speed, all cleaned up and colorized, everybody in the theater just went, oh, wow. Everybody you could not believe it. So if you get a chance to see that movie, I think you'll it's a documentary, you'll enjoy it. There will be, for the members this evening, there will be a meeting after the program. We also have coffee and cookies in between, and we're going to have a half-court shot contest with the basketball net in the back there. All right. Let's see, what else? Okay. Donald, are you ready? Donald will introduce the program for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you to this wonderful meeting of the Historical Association of Woodbridge Township. We meet here every Monday, the last Monday of the month, and we would welcome you to come back. We have exciting programs every meeting, so tonight is no exception. But before I introduce our speaker, I just want to tell you about next month in case you're interested in coming back. If you're at all interested in 18th century medicine, we have a speaker who's with our Monmouth County our Middlesex County Cultural and Heritage Commission. He's not on. Here it goes. And he is Doug Almack, and he's very qualified, and he's going to speak to us on a program titled Bleed, Purge, and Saw. So if you think you have aches and pains and you're worried about going to get your hip replaced or whatever today, think about it. Life was like here in Woodbridge in the 18th century. Bleed, purge, and saw. okay? But tonight, we're not going to talk about those horrible things. We're going to talk about a wonderful person in the history of our country, the wife of the first president of the United States. You know, this is really almost like the year of the woman. Women are more active than they've ever been, and they're out doing their thing, and we welcome the participation of women in religious life and in political life and in economic life and in every aspect of our social society. And so I want to say that because Martha Washington, as our First Lady, was the kind of First Lady that we would like all our First Ladies to emulate. And without any other ado, I want to present to you Martha Washington. Please welcome her.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I think I have one. How are you all today? Very well. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, and I am come here tonight to talk to you a little bit about my life before I became simply Mrs. Washington. I'd like to talk a little bit about my children, my grandchildren, the two great men to whom I was married, and the hopefully helpful part I played in our nation's history. I was born on June 2nd, 1731, to Fanny Jones and Jack Dandridge near Williamsburg, Virginia, at our plantation called Chestnut Grove. Now, in my time, the word plantation defined an agricultural property devoted to the cultivation of a single crop, and in Virginia, we grew tobacco. Chestnut Grove was a typical plantation. Plantations were of many sizes. It was a middle-sized plantation with a comfortable two-story frame house with 3 pine-paneled rooms on each floor, fireplaces at each end of the house, and the kitchen in a separate building in case of fire. I was born on the first floor in my parents' bedroom, and I was their first child. As you can see, I am a brunette with hazel eyes. Well, they've gotten a little lighter with age. And I stand at just barely 5 feet tall, although heeled shoes do help. I was very fortunate to have straight, beautiful teeth throughout most of my life, a rarity in my day, but not in yours, I see. And I have grown a little stouter and more buxom in my middle years, but I was rather slim as a young girl. Would you care to see my portrait? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to start this passing around, but I do have a helper who's going to pass some things out for me. Oh. Now, I suppose that you were expecting perhaps this lady tonight? Well, we can't all of us age gracefully now, can we? So where's my helper? Did she disappear? Oh, here we go. Thank you very much. So on the left, you will see me as I was as an older woman, because most of the portraits that were painted of me were when my husband had already become president, so I was much older. On the right, however, is a portrait that was done forensically, and as I come to you in the year 1772, in my early 40s, I would prefer that you remember me as I am now and not as I became. So can we all agree on that? Thank you. So we'll pass these around. Even though, as the firstborn, I was named Martha after several maternal ancestors, I was called Patsy by my friends and family well into my 20s. In my time, the nicknames for Martha were Patsy, Patty, and Pat, just as Mary was often shortened to Paul or Polly, and Margaret was Peg or Peggy. So until I was 19 years old, I was Patsy Dandridge. I was uncommonly lucky to have both of my parents all through my childhood and well into my adulthood. As a child, I helped my mother with the household chores and my siblings. By the time I was 8 years old, I had 4 younger siblings, and eventually I would have 7 by my mother. Now, because there were so many people, you can imagine there was much to do on the plantation. And because we had only about 15 slaves, and they were mostly field hands, we did much of the work ourselves. I learned to cook, to sew, to make candles, pluck chickens, to spin and weave and dye wool and linen, and from that we made so many linens and clothes for the household. I made linen shifts and napkins, as diapers were called then, for all my younger siblings. Now, toddlers, they were dressed alike in linen shifts, boys and girls, linen shifts and napkins or diapers. And the leading strings that were attached to their garments at the shoulder were useful for pulling children out of danger, to helping them to walk, or by controlling a temper tantrum. I'm sure you've never had any of those problems with your children yet. So now I do have some images of leading strings to show you. So there are 2 here. There's a yellow one and a blue one. So if you could give each group a yellow and a blue. So the yellow one shows the leading strings actually being used by the mother, and the blue one shows the leading strings hanging down the back of the garment, so you can see what I'm talking about. Now, around the age of 5 or 6, children began to wear smaller versions of adult clothes. And even before the age of 5, I and others like me began wearing a boned garment called stays in order to impose the erect posture expected of a girl of my class. I would never again appear in public without stays. Uncorseted freedom was for easy women and women of loose morals, present company excepted, of course. So, I thought we could, I know there are many gentlemen here tonight, and I don't want to shock anyone, but would you like to see some undergarments of the time?
Yeah.
All right. Now, these are the stays that I was talking about. So they're worn here like this. Now, I'll pass these around while I'm talking. This is all handmade. This is all hand woven. What's inside, please do not try to bend what's inside. They are reeds. And the reeds will only bend with the heat of your body. So I'll pass those around. Now, the clothing that we wear around this time, you can see we have a certain silhouette. So it's flat in the front, relatively flat in the back, and wide on the sides. And you might say, well, Patsy, why would you want your hips to look so wide? And I would tell you, because the wider your hips, the smaller your waist looks. And that's the important thing. Yes. So, in order to achieve this look, you have to have the correct foundation garments. So you start with the chemise or a shift, which is here, here, goes all the way down. And you would always wear your stays over your shift. You never wear your stays against your skin, because you want to protect the stays from body oils, perspiration, that kind of thing. Then you have your petticoats. You have your stockings, of course, and shoes, which I'll show everyone later. The gown, this is called a robe à la française, or a sack-back gown. And do you see all this fabric in the back? This serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. This is called conspicuous consumption. So this just means that I have enough money to buy all this extra fabric that I don't need at all on this dress. So there are different kinds of gowns. We have a round gown, we have the English gown, a caraco jacket, and this would be the robe à la française, or the sack-back gown. And it comes in 3 pieces. You have your petticoat, your underskirt, you have the overdress, and then you have what's called the stomacher. And this goes right in the middle, and this can be interchangeable. And it can match your underskirt or not, and you can change them out. Now, in order to get the shape of the skirts, we wear either hip pads or something called paniers. Panier is French for basket, and they're called pocket hoops. and I have a pair to show you here. Could I have a volunteer? All right, so let's imagine that you're going to be wearing an 18th century gown. So we'll have you do a little fashion turn.
You sit in this? Yeah.
Oh, yes. What's your name?
Edie.
Edie. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Edie. Could we have a round of applause, please? Now, Edie is wearing her most fashionable panniers, and she's going to go down the center aisle and back so we can see. Now, her skirts would be over that, and the way the skirts, the underskirts, are made, they come up from the front and tie in the back, and come up from the back and tie in the front. This allows you to have a pocket on the side so that you can access your panniers. So, and as you can see, if we need to go through a narrow doorway, we can pull in our panniers. All right. Thank you very much. Now, in case you're not wearing panniers and you're wearing hip pads, or if you're wearing a work dress and you're not wearing any kind of foundation garments, thank you so much, you might have to wear pockets. So this is a pair of pockets that would go underneath your gown, and you can put your hands in. So I'll pass these around so everyone can see those.
How long does it take to actually get dressed?
Not long, 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Unless you're having a very elaborate hairstyle, in which case you might want to count 2 hours. So, even though I may have convinced you otherwise, I am a lady of some social standing. The gentry, of whom my family was a part, trained children young in essential behaviors. The British aristocracy was the ideal, of course, no matter your family's origin. As a young girl, I was trained to manage my wide skirts, to dress stylishly, to set a table correctly, to make conversation and be sociable and gracious to guests, to sing, and to dance. I love to do all of these things, but dancing in particular was very important for acceptance in Virginia society because Virginians love to dance. What would happen is our parents would engage dancing masters who would come to one of the houses, and then all of the young people would go and spend 3 or 4 days at that house with the dancing master to learn the steps so as not to make a fool of oneself at the next ball. Yes, religion was important too, but going to church for the young people meant socializing in our small rural community. Now, the capital was Williamsburg, and it had almost 1,000 permanent residents by 1748. Can you imagine? It was an exciting metropolis to us with its grand public buildings, racetrack, the taverns. There was an apothecary, a wig maker, silver, gun, and blacksmiths, and no end of tantalizing shops. It was the biggest town that I had ever seen. Now, my father was a vestryman as well as an important member of the community in that he was a council member and a county official. But even though he was important to the community, we were not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. I was tutored mostly by my mother and a tutor at home, but I learned to read and write and figure passably well. If you happen to read any of my correspondence, please don't judge me. Spelling was not standardized at the time. I got along just fine. In fact, I did administer my husband's estate when he passed. My first husband, that is. My first husband was Daniel Park Custis, and he was a member of one of the most elite, the oldest, richest colonial families. And at first, I thought that we would not be able to marry at all. Do you know why? Because his father, the Colonel John Custis, refused to accept that his son would marry me. I was not the first woman that his father had told him he could not marry, but the problem here was that my family's wealth was not as large as my family, and my parents could not afford a very large dowry for me. And so the Colonel John Custis, well, he went into a rage, and he thundered up and down the town of Williamsburg to his friends that he had not spent a lifetime increasing his family's fortune to see it spent by any daughter of Jack Dandridge. He even went so far as to say that he would rather throw the family silver out into the street than see me get my hands on it. Some of Daniel's friends wanted to intercede, but I went to see the old codger myself. And I think we made quite a scene. I, the spunky little 18-year-old, and he, the bewigged and crusty 70-year-old tyrant. But lo and behold, he appreciated that I came to see him, and he told people afterwards that he was impressed by my strength of character. And he did give his permission. Ironically, he died before Daniel and I were able to marry, but marry Daniel I did in 1750. I had known him all my life. He was 20 years older than I, but a kinder man you could not find in all of Virginia. We were married in the parlor of Chestnut Grove, and this was typical of the time. Most brides were married in the parlor of their home because the churches were often so far out of the way and there wasn't anywhere to have dinner or dancing. So we would marry in the parlor, and as did most brides, I wore my most beautiful gown. About a week later, we moved into Daniel's inherited estate, and it was called, coincidentally, White House. My husband had inherited thousands of acres of prime farmland spread over 5 plantations, White House being the main plantation house. He had inherited houses in Williamsburg and Jamestown, nearly 300 slaves, and thousands of pounds of English treasury notes and cash. It was wonderful for me. White House was only 4 miles from Chestnut Grove, but it was quite a step up in the social ladder for me. I, little Patsy Dandridge, now Patsy Dandridge Custis, I was a wealthy woman with social status. And I think that I made Daniel happy too for the first time in his life. His parents had been in a terrible relationship. His mother died when he was young, and his father, as you can tell, was quite abusive. So I loved and supported him in everything he did, and he spoiled me, I must say. The 1750s were a wonderful time for us planters. It was a time of conspicuous consumption, and at the center of planter hospitality, because we entertained frequently, was a separate dining room. Now, just a generation earlier, a room dedicated solely to eating meals was unheard of. But the new fashion called for individual plates, chairs, napkins, flatware for each individual diner, rather than sharing utensils as had been done in the past. Silver was the metal of choice, and forks were much in use, as they had never been before. Chairs were very expensive. Y'all must be very wealthy here. So they were status symbols, and it was nice to have extras lined up against the wall. So when we moved into White House, I set about decorating the dining room, and I ordered 12 yards of crimson damask from London. Now, I don't think that I was extravagant, but I do like bright colors, lovely fabrics, and nice fashions. Now, I did bring an image here to show you. This is not the dining room of White House, but this is the dining room of my next house. But it just gives you an idea of what it looked like. So we ordered everything from London. You really had to. We didn't have a choice. So when we would have our hogshead of tobacco, they would be sent to London, and then our factors there would tell us how much money we could spend. And we always spent more than we made on our tobacco. But we would have everything shipped over from London. And I loved it when the ships came in. Everyone did. I would order shoes, I would order gowns, we ordered dishware, we ordered a carriage. One time, Daniel ordered me a chaise. He surprised me. This is a one-person carriage with outsized wheels that I could use to tool around Williamsburg in. And I ordered some crimson pumps once, and a quilted petticoat to keep out the drafts. I love shoes, so I ordered a lot of shoes. Who here likes shoes? Well, wait till you see my wedding shoes. I'll show you those later. So in any case, as soon as we were married, I set about creating an orderly household as my mother had taught me, and we entertained frequently. As I mentioned, we always had guests. Breakfast, tea, supper were very small affairs, but dinner, that was another story. Now, dinner was served at the end of the morning, but you would probably refer to it as the afternoon. It was at 3 o'clock, and Daniel and I would dress for dinner after he had gone around the plantation and I'd finished my domestic chores. We would gather in the dining room, and it would be served by 2 men servants, and the fashion called for a very large array of food to be set out every day. We would have hearty toasts with Madeira. That was our favorite wine, to the old King George II. I was with child very soon after our marriage, and in 1751 I gave birth to my first child, a son, whom we called Daniel Park Custis, just like my husband. We had a very small pool of names that we used every generation, so it might be a little difficult for you to sort us all out. I was so happy. I nursed baby Daniel myself, and I found a great deal of joy in so sweet an office. I was thrilled in 1753 to give birth to my first daughter, whom we named Frances, or Fanny, after both her grandmothers. I was so happy to have a little girl, and do you know she had her father wrapped around her little finger. I loved having my 2 babies, but my heart broke 10 months later when my little Daniel fell ill. You all know where I live, and at that time, most people were struck down at one time or another by malaria. Most recovered, but baby Daniel did not. He passed away just after his 2nd birthday. It was a hard business for my husband. We were devastated, as you might imagine, and he had to order a marble tomb from London. Now, around the time of baby Daniel's funeral, I discovered that I was again with child, and in 1754 I gave birth to my 2nd son, whom we named John, or Jackie, after both his grandfathers. Now, 1754 was a very important time for the colonies because France and England were again at their interminable rivalries, and this time the fighting was over the rich and fertile lands of the Ohio Valley. Our new Lieutenant Governor, Dinwiddie, who had arrived in 1751, had orders to keep out the French and to encourage British settlement in the area. So he had an expedition, a force, led by General Braddock and a little-known colonial officer by the name of George Washington. When the French sent their Indian allies to attack, he sent in this force of British regulars, but they were ambushed, and General Braddock was killed. This colonial officer, George Washington, was the general's aide in this battle, and he saw the survivors to safety. And suddenly, all of Virginia was talking about this tall redhead who rode so well and who was so brave. My husband and I had actually discussed Mr. Washington as a rising military star, but we did not know him personally all that well, even though his half-brother Lawrence and my uncle had served together as officers. Now, after all that military excitement, in 1756, my life would change again. That year, my mother and I both gave birth to baby girls. I had my 2nd daughter, whom we called Martha, or Patsy, just like me, and my mother had my littlest sister, Mary. Now, sadly, when Mary was about 5 months old, my father died suddenly of apoplexy, a stroke, leaving my mother a widow with small children to raise. And it did seem prophetic because almost exactly a year later, my little Fanny, my first daughter, took ill and died just before her 4th birthday. I cannot tell you the heartbreak when the ships came from London bringing me the red leather shoes that I had ordered for her birthday, shoes that she would never wear. So I was at White House then in 1757 with 2 babies when my dear husband Daniel fell ill on July 4th with what was probably scarlet fever. By July 8th, he was dead after only 7 years of wedded bliss. So there I was, 26 years old, with 2 babies and 5 plantations to run. I decided that I would administer Daniel's estate myself, but I had no intention of inhabiting the rough world of men's affairs for long. Besides, it would have been extremely eccentric if a wealthy widow such as myself would remain unmarried for long. At that time, it was acceptable for a courtship to begin even 1 or 2 months after your spouse had passed. So 8 months later, I was being actively courted by a very wealthy, older gentleman by the name of Charles Carter. He was handsome, very nice, but he just had so many children. I think he had 10 at home. I love children, and he was an older man. Been there, done that. So the other man was the colonial officer that I told you about, George Washington. Can I confide in you that I fell in love with him from the moment I set eyes on him the first time I saw him after Daniel's death? He was so tall and handsome. Everything that I'd heard about him was true. He had auburn hair, blue-gray eyes, a strong nose, fair skin. He stood over a foot taller than I. He danced so well, rode so well. Oh. Well, we corresponded quite a bit that spring. I don't think he fell in love with me right away, but I think he realized that we would be a good match. And I think my money was very interesting, too. It allowed him to finally become a gentleman farmer. He had decided that the discrimination that he suffered in the Army, knowing a colonial officer would never be made a royal officer, he had decided he'd had enough of the military life for the time being and wanted to become a gentleman farmer, having inherited from his half-brother Lawrence an estate called Mount Vernon, yes. And my money allowed him to do that. So we had decided to marry in 1759, in the new year, although because he had given up the military, it really wasn't important. The reason that 1759 was important for militarily was because England had won Quebec from the French, and this eventually led to the end of the French and Indian War. So he wore, to our wedding, instead of a uniform, a blue velvet suit. And I wore a beautiful gown. It had a white silk underskirt, embroidered in silver thread, a deep yellow overgown with silver lace at the sleeves and neck. I twirled some pearls in my hair. Pearls and garnets are my favorite gems. And I had the most fabulous shoes. They were purple silk with silver threads. Would you care to see them?
Yes.
I thought you might.
Oh, look at this.
Yes, I know. Now, so everyone can see, one moment, buckle myself back in here. A friend of mine made me a little model of my shoe. So I'll send it around, and inside there's a picture of what my shoes look like now. They have not aged as gracefully as I. So here we go. You can have that go around. Now, we were married on 12th night of 1759 in the parlor of White House, surrounded by our friends and family. Now, how many of you have been to my home of Mount Vernon? Have you been in the spring? I am sure that that is why George wanted to wait until April to take me to Mount Vernon, because he wanted me to see it in all her glory. And she is glorious in the spring. So we left in April to begin our lives, loving partnership, simple lives as colonial planters. We had no idea what lay in store. Loving partnership, yes. Simple lives, no. Now, because it often comes up, I will tell you that my George had had an infatuation with the wife of his neighbor. Her name was Sally Fairfax. And I never let them know that I was aware of it, but I greeted Sally with warmth and treated her as a friend all the years that we lived as neighbors. And eventually, George's fascination cooled to friendship as he realized the joys of marriage. We had a loving relationship that lasted for over 40 years. Yes. He was a wonderful husband. He was a wonderful stepfather to my children. And at that time, we lived simply. We rose before dawn. I would spend an hour with my Bible in devotions, and then I would lead all of the household servants in the sewing and the cooking and deciding what we were going to eat that day. And George would ride out on the fields and check on everything, and he would often get off the horse himself and show people what to do. He was very hands-on. And then at 3 o'clock, as I mentioned, we would have dinner. George would come back from riding over the fields, and he would change for dinner, as would I, and George would powder his hair. My George never wore a wig, ever. Not in any portrait that you see. He is never wearing a wig, and he doesn't have wooden teeth either. Yeah, so I have a picture of that I can show you later. In any case, we spent our days with lots of company. We always had visitors. I tutored the children myself for their first lessons. We would adjourn to the parlor in the afternoons and the late evenings. We would sing, play games, dance. George inscribed for me a copy of The Bullfinch, which was a collection of popular English songs. And it was the first time that he had written out my name as Martha Washington. My friends and family still called me Patsy, but I was beginning to be known in more formal circles as Martha. Now, one shadow on our lives together at this time is, by the time I was this age, after 12 or 13 years of marriage, we realized that I was not going to be giving George any children. I don't know if in 1756, at the birth of Patsy, I suffered some internal injury, but I think the more... Who gets blamed when a child is not produced? Yes. However, George, the one time that he left the colonies was to go to Barbados with his half-brother Lawrence, and he contracted smallpox. Light case, but smallpox can cause sterility. So, I'm not laying blame, I'm just saying. So except for this, I consider these our golden years. Very happy. I don't think anyone would have imagined that the English winning the French and Indian War would have eventually led to the American Revolution, but it did. All through the 1760s, we were loyal to the king, but Parliament was constantly taxing us, and repealing, taxing, repealing, and eventually pushing more and more Americans to defiance and ultimately revolution. But the year that stands out in my mind during this time is 1768. In that year, Jackie was 14, Patsy was 12, and in January of that year, she began to have very serious seizures. And her care became the center of my life. It made it a little easier to send Jackie off to boarding school, something I never thought that I would be able to do. Having lost 2 children already, I was rather overprotective. But there was no cure for epilepsy in my day, and we did everything we could to give Patsy as normal an adolescence as we could. Now, as for Jackie, shall we say that school was not his strong suit. He studied little and socialized much. And in 1772, He came home for a visit, bringing with him a young portrait painter by the name of Charles Wilson Peale from Annapolis. And we sat for portraits. I even convinced George to sit for one, even though he didn't want to. And it was the first portrait of him before he became famous. Jackie had another little surprise for us. He had fallen in love with a girl by the name of Nellie Calvert, Eleanor Calvert. She came from a very good family. George was not keen on them getting married because Jackie was only 18 and she was only 15, almost 16. But I was very happy. I thought maybe she's just what he needs. Nellie was a sweet girl, and she looked so much like my Patsy that the two girls could have passed for sisters. And indeed, they became fast friends. Nellie was visiting with us in 1773, that summer, when tragedy struck. Yes, I know. It was after dinner. The girls had been talking, of course, about Jackie, and Patsy mentioned that she had a recent letter from Jackie, and she went to her room to fetch that letter. Nellie heard a noise, and when she went to Patsy's room, Patsy was in the throes of a grand mal seizure. Nellie ran for help. I didn't know what to do. George held her in his arms. She died in less than 2 minutes without uttering a word, a groan, or scarce a sigh. I was prostrate with grief, as you can imagine. I couldn't even attend the funeral. I was so thankful to have Nellie with me during those weeks, and a lifelong bond was created between us at that time. She and Jackie married in 1774. Only a couple of months after Patsy's death, we heard about an event called the Boston Tea Party. Perhaps you know of it? And the reason I choose to come to you in 1772 is because it's before Patsy's death, before the Boston Tea Party, before we went to war against England, and before everything changed forever. Now, when we heard about this, they chose 7 delegates to go to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. George, of course, was among them. And then there was the Second Continental Congress, and I was unprepared for the news that came. My George had been chosen to lead what was being called the Continental Army against what was then the greatest military power on earth. It was incredible. George wrote to me asking me to join him in Cambridge for the winter because he was not going to be able to come home for Christmas, and I did. It was the first time that I'd been north of Annapolis, and I knew during that trip that our lives had changed irrevocably, because as I would come to a town, people would come out and greet me as if I were a very great somebody. They were so happy to have George to lead them. I joined George that winter. I joined George every winter in his winter quarters to try to make a home for him wherever he was so that he could concentrate on winning the war. I was with him in Morristown both years. I was in New York. I met the Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, who were like sons to my husband. I was in New York when it became too dangerous. He sent me to Philadelphia. I was in Philadelphia when the Declaration of Independence was read, even though George was not. I was with him in Valley Forge that terrible winter. George said that if I had not been with him all through the 8 years of the Revolution, I was with him over 50% of the time, that he would not have been able to carry on as he did. He only went home one time in 8 years, only for a couple of days. So every summer, almost, I would go home to oversee things at Mount Vernon, and then every winter I would join him in winter quarters. I would gather the ladies, the other officers' wives, and I would organize sewing and knitting circles and try to entertain as best we could in our makeshift quarters. The officers said that they also were very happy to see me arrive. They called me Lady Washington and said that I helped boost morale when they were fearing the worst. And that winter in Valley Forge was so difficult because I think the greatest thing about my husband was not so much the battles that he won, because actually he didn't win all that many, but it was keeping that ragtag army together despite having no supplies, no support from Congress, no money to pay the men. That was his strength. So finally, in 1778, we got long-awaited news. France had finally become our ally, and we thought the war would be over. But it went on and on until 1783. Now, the best years of the Revolutionary War, the best times during those years, were from 1776 to 1781. My Jackie and his wife Nellie had 4 children. George and I became grandparents. 3 girls, and then finally a boy. But the worst time of the Revolutionary War was in 1781, in what should have been the happiest year because it was the Battle of Yorktown. My Jackie decided to accompany George as a camp observer, or an aide, if you will. And he contracted camp fever, typhus. This was in November. George sent him to my brother-in-law's house to recuperate. He wasn't much worried about him, but he worsened. And we were all of us at his bedside when he passed. My son, my last child. At that time, I had outlived all of my children and all but 2 of my siblings, and I would outlive them as well. I outlived everyone. I don't recommend it. Well, that's all in the past. After the Revolution, Nellie, Jackie having passed on, of course, with our blessing, married a young physician by the name of David Stewart, and she had many children with him. She had 23 children in all. 23 children in all. So you will understand that she kept her 2 oldest daughters, Jackie's 2 oldest daughters, with her. But her 2 youngest, Nellie and Wash, she allowed George and I to raise as our own. This was very typical in our time that childless couples could informally adopt or formally adopt extra children, so to speak, so they would have a family heir. Would you care to see their portraits? Yeah. Not as if you had a choice, because proud grandmother and all. So I have a few portraits here that I'm going to send around. The first is my husband during the Revolution. You can see his auburn hair and his blue-gray eyes. I would also like to pass around a portrait of George and I with Jackie and Patsy when they were young. They were just toddlers, 1757, or 59, sorry. And then I will describe this, and then I'll pass it around. This is my husband, my first husband, Daniel Park Custis. This is George. This is that first portrait that Charles Wilson Peale did. These are my grandchildren, Nellie and Wash, whom I raised as my own. These are my other 2 granddaughters. This is Betsy and this is Patsy. This is my niece, Frances. I'll talk about her in a minute. This is Patsy and this is Jackie. I don't have portraits of Daniel and Fanny because they died too young, but these were done in 1772. So those are Patsy and Jackie. Mount Vernon is here. And then my niece, Fanny, I had told my sister Nancy that if she passed, I would take Fanny into my home, and I did. And she came to live with us when she was 16 years old. And eventually she married one of George's nephews, thus uniting our 2 families. Isn't that wonderful? Now, what was not so wonderful was that after the Revolution, my husband was unanimously elected to become president of the new United States, an honor he did not wish, and I certainly did not want him to accept. But he knew where his duty lay, and I knew also, and we accepted it. And you know the story. He served 2 long, troublesome terms. from 1789 to 1793, 93 to 97. We were in New York as the capital, and then Philadelphia as the capital. We were in Germantown during the yellow fever epidemic, back to Philadelphia. I did like that town. We attended the theater often there. My friend Abigail Adams, she helped me during those times because we were trying to establish this new country, this new government that no one had ever seen before, and we had to walk a fine line between creating something that would garner the respect of other nations without falling into the traditions of a monarchy. Abigail told me that she thought George was truly the father of our country and that Providence had selected him because he had no children of his own. There was no fear that he would pass the power on to a son. And he always gave power back. Every time he was given power, he gave it back. And this had never happened before. So he traveled very much during those years. He wanted to visit all the states, which he did. He was also very busy creating the new capital and the executive mansion, the presidential mansion, which I never lived in, although my friend Abigail did. It was a very busy time. And finally, in 1797, we were able to return to Mount Vernon, to resume our lives as not colonial, but American planters. And now it is time for me to tell you the saddest part. My George was only able to enjoy his retirement from public life for 2 years. In December of 1799, the weather was terrible. George had ridden out in the fields, and he came back with a very sore throat. The next day, he went out to mark trees for felling, and he came back in late for dinner. He was wet, he was soaked, and he would not go and change for dinner, as I asked him to do. He got a virulent throat infection. And that night, as we lay in bed, I wanted to rise to go get the doctor, get some help. And he said, "No, I don't want you to go out in the cold. You'll get sick too." He held me in his arms. We talked about the possibility of his death. He instructed me as to what to do with his wills. In the morning, I sent for Dr. Craik and others. They came. They did all they could. But finally, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 14th of December, 1799, my George said, "Enough." He made them stop, and he passed. His last words were, "'Tis well." All was not well with me. I was absolutely destroyed when my George died, and I closed the door to the bedroom that we had shared for 40 years, and I moved myself up to the 3rd floor. I very rarely came down after that. I spent my time rereading the hundreds of letters that we had sent to one another over the years, and I very carefully burned each and every one. I followed him one last time on May 22nd, 1802. But I am very proud to have been his wife. I am proud of the role that we played in establishing this country, and I see that that pride goes on today. So I thank you for having me here tonight so that you could get to know me as a wife and a woman, and not simply Mrs. Washington, although it is a role I was proud to play. And I will come around so everyone can see the shoes, and if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just take a little walk down so you can see the shoes. Everyone loves the wedding shoes.
They look comfortable.
Yes, they are, actually.
Come from Paris?
Yes, mostly Paris, yes. France has always been the leader of fashion for hundreds of years.
Very pretty. I always like sparkly.
Yes.
Are there any of your shoes in a museum right now?
Yes, I think these are, yes. So I think they're out Mount Vernon, actually. I think, yes.
Thank you. I understand he was like 61 when he died?
67.
Oh, he was 67.
And I was 70.
Yeah, you were old.
Yes.
Fabulous. I love the color on you.
Thank you.
Is that Martha's favorite color, shoe?
Oh, yes. I like purple shoes. So, did anyone have any questions? Ma'am. Oh, the teeth. Well, here, we'll just do one, and here's one.
Oh, the teeth.
Okay. Have you seen portraits of my husband? Yes. Do you know how he always looks like? Well, the reason for that is because he had dentures. He started losing his teeth at the age of 26. And by the time he was president, he only had one tooth left in his mouth to anchor this. We spent so much money on dentists, toothbrushes, toothpaste, teeth, because at that time, people would sell their hair and their teeth for money. And so he would buy human teeth, and also he had teeth that were carved from ivory, which is why people thought they were wooden, because the ivory got brown with age and people thought it was wood. So there was a spring action, and so he had to clamp his mouth shut tight. It was so he could chew. But if he just let his mouth open, it would be like this. So the poor man suffered for years and years and years with dental problems.
So the teeth was the first precursor to implants?
Well, yes, pretty much. So but this was dentistry. For example, you know the little princess Marie Antoinette who was sent to France and became queen? She had braces put on her teeth back in the 1750s. So dentistry was actually something that existed, not as good as it obviously is today, but yes, we did have dentists, and they were able to do things like this. No implants, though. No implants.
What happened to the White House that you lived in?
Oh, White House burned at some point, no longer exists. But you might be familiar with my grandson, Wash, inherited one part of the estate and built Arlington. And his daughter, so my great-granddaughter, she married Robert E. Lee. And so during the Civil War, as a punishment for Lee, they used it as a Union cemetery. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, most of us from Woodbridge are familiar with the fact that George Washington stopped here on his way to his inauguration. Were you with him at that point, or did he travel alone?
I was not at the first inauguration. I was at the second, though. Yes.
Could you just explain that when you said you accompanied your husband during the winter, how long was that winter stay?
It varied, but it was usually several months, because the armies would stop fighting as soon as the weather got bad. And so the women, some of the women, Lucy Knox, Kitty Green, Eliza Hamilton, we would try to provide, shall I say, a homey experience for our husbands while they were away. So as soon as the fighting would stop and it was safe, then we would travel to go meet our husbands wherever they were in winter quarters.
Okay, so we're talking about December to May?
It could be December, it could be November, it depended. Usually December was yes. Well, sometimes I would go back in March. Other times I wouldn't go back till June. So every year was different. So for 8 years I did that. Yes, thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
How did you and George actually meet or get connected?
That's a very interesting story. I was a widow, and I was staying with some friends, and he was met on the road by one of the gentlemen, and he was invited to come back, and he was sick, actually. He wasn't well, and I nursed him a little bit, so maybe maybe that was a bit of an attraction there, but it was the first time that we had really been in an intimate setting together. I had heard of him, I'd seen him at a distance, but we really didn't have a personal connection until that time. And I fell in love with him during that visit. He stayed overnight, and not with me, at the house. And yeah, so it was an enjoyable 2 days, and I invited him to come to White House, and he did. 2 weeks later, I think, he came. Yes?
Did you go to Jockey Hollow?
Did I go to Jockey Hollow? Oh, I don't remember. Oh, my goodness, I was so many places. Morristown. I was in Morristown both years. Is that Jockey Hollow's near there?
Yeah.
All right, then. Yes, I was there.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Could you dress yourself with all those clothes?
I can dress myself. I usually don't. I had a wonderful, adorable lady's maid by the name of Oni Judge. Unfortunately, I didn't understand that she would rather be free than taken care of. I didn't understand. And when we went to Philadelphia, she actually left me and ran away. And we weren't, yes, she was a slave, as was Hercules, our cook, who also ran away. And it was not something that I understood. I was so feared for her safety. I made George try to find her. We didn't, though. So it was very sad. I was sad to lose her, but I always had a lady's maid to help me. Yes. Any other questions? Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I think you have some refreshments at the back of the room. If you have any of the handouts or the frames or anything like that, if you would be so kind as to bring them up to the table, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. So nice to be with you all this evening. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.